Hello everyone, my name is Dogly. Heizou is the newest character in Genshin Impact and he has been out for about a week now. While his characterization and personality tell us that he doesn't like using his fists and would rather solve his cases with his smarts, I'm sure most of us have been ignoring that and are using him to smack around a ton of enemies and monsters in the game. However, this guide will help you balance Heizou's powerful punches with his powerful brain by giving you all the tips and tricks you need to optimize your Heizou's potential. And trust me when I say it, Heizou does have a lot of potential despite having a few minor flaws. As a brief overview, Heizou is an Anemo Catalyst user that uses his fists and feet to attack at close range. Because all of his attacks deal Anemo damage, he can serve as a great driver for other characters that activate their bursts based on normal attacks, such as Xingqiu, Yelan, and Beidou. A driver is a character that stays on field to attack while boosting the damage of off-field DPS teammates. Heizou's charge attacks also have no internal cooldown, or ICD. This means his charge attacks can always trigger a swirl reaction. To conserve stamina, one of the most popular attack combos for Heizou is to alternate between normal and charge attacks to achieve the smoothest rotation. Heizou's first Ascension passive allows him to build a stack every time he swirls, up to 4 stacks. These stacks are then consumed when Heizou uses his elemental skill, which turns the skill into quite a powerful nuke. The powerful punch is Heizou's main selling point, allowing him to be a driver that also has high personal damage. Heizou's ultimate has a low energy cost and can hit hard, but not quite as hard as his skill with max stacks. I want to talk about Constellations early on, since at the time of writing this, the community as a whole really seems to not be in agreement. I'm going to jump around the Constellations out of order so that I can talk about the biggest misconceptions I've been seeing first. In particular, I think 2 of his constellations are incredibly overhyped, and actually not as helpful as players might think. Here I'm talking about Heizou's C2 and C6. Heizou's Constellation 2 is worded in a way that makes players think it greatly improves his crowd control ability with the vacuum of his ultimate. Compared to other Anemo characters, the one thing that a C0 Heizou lacks is decent crowd control. His ultimate can knock back and suck in small enemies, but the AoE and suction power of Heizou is significantly lower than that of all of Sucrose, Kazuha, and Venti. This leads many players to read Heizou's C2 and think that it will magically fix Heizou's lacking crowd control. However, the truth is C2 is kinda useless. C2 does not increase the radius of Heizou's suction, and the only practical and minor improvement it does is that it can slightly move or stagger mid-sized enemies like Fatui agents. But in most combat scenarios, I can't even tell the difference. I know at the beginning of his release, many players hoped that C2 would make Heizou into a viable crowd controller, but that is simply not the case in my experience. Next up is C6, which essentially gives Heizou's elemental skill extra crit rate and extra crit damage. While the stated effect in the text is very true, I think that players should be careful and not overestimate the damage increase. Through my own testing with Heizou, I actually found that C3 increased my Heizou skill damage more than C6 did. Testing this on my main account at C0 through C2, my Heizou holding an R2 Skyward Atlas could punch for just over 90k damage with Bennett and Shangling buffs. At C3, which buffs his elemental skill level, this then increased to 106,000 damage, or an increase of 16,000. Lastly, at C6 the damage went up to 119,000, which is an increase of only 13,000. Both of these damage buffs are fairly significant, but for most players you will see a higher increase at C3 than C6. While some people may get caught up in the hype, I think C6 from a cost analysis perspective does not make sense for most players unless you're already summoning for multiple Kazuha constellations as well. If you really want a power boost, C3 is the biggest power spike you will get from Heizou. On my second account, I stopped summoning at C3, and I think that was a great stopping point. And now that we've gotten the misconceptions out of the way, let's talk about Heizou's other constellations, his C1 and his C4. I think Constellation 1 is actually an underrated constellation. Basically, whenever you switch Heizou in, he gains 1 stack for his elemental skill and a normal attack speed buff. The speed buff isn't that noticeable, but the extra stack does come into play as it lets you get to 4 stacks faster and just makes Heizou's rotations feel smoother. It's not a huge improvement, but a nice little quality of life improvement. On my third account, I only have a C0 Heizou, so when I don't have C1, I do notice the difference playing Heizou on that account compared to my other two. Lastly, there's Constellation 4. Basically, C4 gives Heizou some energy back after he uses his ultimate skill. Since Heizou has a 40 energy cost burst, the energy boost is helpful but not really required. All in all, I think it says something when Heizou's best constellation is C3, or just the standard buff to his elemental skill. Compared to earlier 4-star characters in the game, I feel like newer ones really haven't had that great of constellations, and I am kind of bummed out about how lackluster Heizou's constellations are. They aren't terrible, but they don't feel significant either. On the other hand though, Heizou at C0 feels like a very well developed, very fun, and perfectly viable character. If you have C0 Heizou and there's no other characters you want on this banner, then stopping at C0 is a very valid choice and you can still get the full Heizou experience without constellations. Heizou's weapon options are plentiful. Pretty much any 5-star catalyst will see good results on Heizou, though if using the Memory of Dust, then Heizou of course benefits from a shielding teammate. I personally have been seeing the highest damage with Skyward Atlas, whereas the passives on Lost Prayer and Kagura's Verity can be annoying to achieve, but their crit main stats can be quite good. For 4-star options, Widsith and Solar Pearl both have passives that work very nicely with Heizou's kit. Sacrificial Fragments works great for EM builds and non-EM builds as well. And lastly, if you have none of the above, then the free-to-play options of Dodeko Tails or the craftable Mappe Mare can be used. Up next, let's talk about artifacts for Heizou. You don't need to be a detective to know that Viridescent Venerer is a great artifact set for Heizou, as it will allow him to increase the damage of his teammates that he's driving for. Some players might be tempted to try a 2-piece Viridescent set and a 2-piece Glad set to boost Heizou's personal damage, but the 4-piece VV set is the superior choice when Heizou is driving for Pyro, Electro, Cryo, or Hydro teammates. If on a freeze team, Heizou could use a Blizzard Strayer set to take advantage of the 40% extra crit rate, which is a viable alternative. 4-piece Thundering Fury has been floated around as an option for Taser teams, but in my testing I couldn't ever get the reduction in his skill's cooldown to ever feel significant, especially when VV buffs are just so much stronger and give you so much more overall damage. So VV is the way to go, but in some cases Freeze Heizou can use Blizzard Strayer. In terms of artifact stats, I think Heizou is rather flexible. For main stats and attack percent Sands, Anemo Damage Goblet, and Crit Helmet will give Heizou the highest personal damage. An Elemental Mastery build is also viable to increase Heizou's swirls, but for the most part it is suggested that EM works best on Taser teams because of how reactions can jump around even more on that team build. For players with limited resin for artifact farming, I think mixing and matching between ADC and EM artifacts is completely viable, and just going with a single piece with the best substat rolls on a usable main stat piece can work out too. Speaking of artifact substats, Heizou's most valuable substats are crit rate, crit damage, elemental mastery, and attack percent. Having a minor amount of energy recharge, about 120%, can be helpful if you are below Constellation 4, but if your teammates generate a lot of particles, then energy recharge substats are not needed for Heizou. Lastly, let's talk about team options for Heizou. Now, I've seen some other creators spend some time in this section talking about which teams you should use Heizou in compared to which teams Sucrose should be in. While you can try to theory craft the strengths and weaknesses of both characters, I think that both perform the same role with only minor differences. However, both characters feel very different to play, and if you're someone who recently got Heizou and you think he's more fun to play than Sucrose, I'm of the mindset that you can play him with whatever team you were using Sucrose with beforehand. My opinion is the feel of the character should take priority over the hypothetical 5% damage gain or increase between using one or the other. As a driver, Heizou's team composition should be built around causing a swirlable reaction. Of the available reactions, Vaporize and Electrocharged tend to work the best with Heizou in my experience, while Freeze and Melt can be viable under certain conditions, but generally I think Ayaka's existence makes her a superior freeze driver. However, if you find Heizou more fun than Ayaka, or if you don't have an Ayaka, then Heizou can definitely work well with freeze teams as well. The one reaction that I think is hardest to build with Heizou is Overloaded, since the knockback is so strong that Heizou's lackluster crowd control has no hopes of keeping the enemies close enough to attack. If you're trying to build a swirl-based team with Heizou, Vaporize has the ability to give Heizou a strong buff to his personal damage. A team of Heizou, Bennett, Xiangling, and one of Xingqiu or Yelan can give Heizou a Benny buff, Guoba Pepper, and Pyro Resonance. For nuke showcases, Mona can be used in the Hydro slot as well. For taser teams, I think Heizou has a lot of flexibility for teammates. I personally have really enjoyed my team of Heizou, Yaimiko, Yelan, and Kokomi, which can functionally have a 100% uptime for both Hydro and Electro elements, and Kokomi's thrilling tales of Dragon Slayers can give Heizou a sizable attack boost as well. Other Electro teammates can include Raiden Shogun, Beidou, and Fischl, whereas Xingqiu can be used if you don't have Yelan. Personally, in my limited testing so far, I wouldn't truly recommend pairing Heizou with Kuki Shinobu, as I feel that other Electro options just provide more damage and more utility, even if Kuki can make higher Electro-charged numbers. Across most team variations, one thing that should be noted is that Heizou is quite frail, and being knocked back, staggered, or otherwise forced to dodge will cause a massive loss in Heizou's ability to drive his teammates. To put it simply, if you're not attacking, then you're not driving. Because of this, using a shield or stagger resistance of some kind is also quite viable with Heizou. Even in situations where you have Yelan, Xingqiu's stagger resistance might be helpful enough to use him instead of her against certain enemies. Additionally, C1 Beidou's shield can be helpful too. Lastly, while he's not very meta, Toma can be a decent shield partner as well, but he will give you much less burst damage than Xiangling. Overall though, I personally found Toma to fit smoothly into rotations on a vaporized team of Heizou, Bennett, Toma, and Yelan, as Toma allowed me to use Yelan instead of Xingqiu while still not getting pushed around by powerful enemy attacks. And well, that's Heizou in a nutshell. Heizou is one of the most fun characters I've played in a long while. So fun that I have him at level 90 on all 3 of my accounts. I hope this video has helped you solve the case on how to use this new character. Please comment down below to let me know what your favorite Heizou teams are, and feel free to ask any questions about him that I wasn't able to cover here. My upload schedule is becoming more regular, and I have a few video series that I have planned, so if you want to watch more of my content, please consider subscribing. Until I see you next time, goodbye everyone, and good luck with your Genshin summons and artifact farming. Bye!